It is hard to believe that in any other place or time, past or future, his publications would have found many readers. But as it was, the thing most needed by his generation seemed to be the recipe he offered.
Robert Aickman was the author of Strange Tales, in fact 48 complete Strange Tales, published between 1951 and 1985 in 8 books. His first short story collection, We're for the Dark, written with Elizabeth Jane Howard, was subtitled 6 Ghost Stories. But Ghost Stories doesn't start to explain what they had written in this landmark collection of unsettling, bizarre and surreal tales. Over a decade later, Aickman's next collection, Dark Entries, was subtitled Curious and Macabre Ghost Stories. Powers of Darkness were simply macabre stories, but none of these terms get to the heart of what he was really up to as a writer. But then, in 1968, Sub Rosa was published, and proclaimed itself a volume of Strange Tales, a term that he preferred, and which has become his own. Strange Tales has become synonymous with Aickman-esque. Robert Aickman wrote that the idea of ghost stories simply being about people returned from the dead had been superseded. He realised that it can be more frightening if you cannot tell whether it is a ghost or not. And so the traditional ghost story went out of date in 1968. It was superseded by Robert Aickman's Strange Tales. But what is a strange tale? How do we define Aickman-esque? Can it be analysed? Perhaps all we can say is that Aickman wrote stories about phenomena for which there is often either a supernatural or a psychological explanation, but in which neither quite suffices on its own. If you try to analyse them with both approaches, then the supernatural undermines the psychological, and vice versa.
How would you define Aickman-esque? It's one of those words that, unless you know Robert Aickman, it's probably useless, because it refers to his work, and there's nobody else like Robert Aickman. I would say it's something to do, if you had an attempt at defining it, it's something to do with strangeness, singularity, a certain atmosphere, a kind of melancholy, a sense of mystery, a sense of wonder, a sense of fear, but not a sort of terror-style fear. More, it's almost closer to, for me, a sort of religious awe or spiritual awe. Very, very particular thing, and hard to think of another author who does what Aickman does.
Aickman-esque, I think the easiest way of defining it is to actually give an example of a kind of characteristic Aickman-esque moment. One of his best stories is called The Hospice, and it starts fairly conventionally as a strange story with a man in a car losing his way and finding himself coming to a strange house and appealing for help. And the house is called The Hospice, and the first sort of characteristic Aickman-esque feature of it is that one's never quite sure precisely what this hospice is. Is it an asylum? Is it a sanatorium? Is it just a rather odd hotel? Is it a sort of rehabilitation centre? Is it a convalescent home?
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wondered if you could help me.
Robert Aickman was born in London in 1914. He was the only son in a rather dysfunctional family. Their problems were largely caused by his elderly and eccentric father, who was unable to deal with everyday life and could be relied upon only to cause unnecessary complications. Robert's mother tolerated her husband for as long as she could, but eventually left the family home. Robert Aickman was something of an authority on supernatural fiction. Between 1964 and 1972, he edited 8 volumes of the Fontana Book of Great Ghost Stories. He said that there were 2 good reasons to read them. The first is the need we all must feel for for some degree of reconciliation with death. The second is vaguer, but more continuously present in the consciousness of most of us, the need to escape, at least occasionally, from a mechanistic world, ever more definable, ever more predictable, and therefore ever more unsatisfying and frustrating. It is as an antidote to daily living, and the ghost story hints to us that there is a world elsewhere, as Coriolanus put it. Controversially, Aickman also included his own stories in most of the volumes, one of which was The Inner Room.
At the back of the shop was a window, curtained all over in grey lace. Through this much-filtered illumination glimmered the facade of an enormous doll's house. I wanted it at once. Dolls had never been central to my happiness, but this abode of theirs was the most grown-up thing in the shop. It had battlements and long straight walls and a variety of pointed windows. A Gothic revival house, no doubt, or even mansion. It was painted the colour of stone, a grey stone darker than the grey light which flickered round it. There was a two-leaved front door with a small classical portico. It was impossible to see the whole house at once, as it stood grimed and neglected on the corner of the wide trestle shelf. Very slowly I walked along two of the sides, the other two being dark against the walls of the shop. From a first-floor window in the side not immediately visible as one approached, leaned a doll, droopy and unkempt.
Most effective authors of supernatural tales don't believe in the phenomena they describe. Aickman was unusual in that he was a believer. He was an active member of the Society for Psychical Research and visited Borley Rectory, said to be the most haunted house in England. Despite his distrust of technology, he was convinced that science would eventually find an explanation for ghostly apparitions. Aickman suggests that ghost stories need not just be about the dead haunting the living. His writing, like all good genre fiction, explores and questions many aspects of the human condition. But ghost stories ought to be unnerving, and the best of them will give us sleepless nights. Aickman's strange tales are often very frightening, and one of the ways he achieves this is that, like his grandfather Richard Marsh, he embarked upon no foolish explanations. Perhaps one of the best examples of Aickman's technique is The Swords. It was filmed in the US in 1997, and the main character is experienced and world-weary, unlike Aickman's original protagonist, who is young and immature. In the TV adaptation, the drama is set in a sophisticated nightclub, whereas Aickman's hero originally finds himself in a seedy fun fair in Wolverhampton. Both witness an attraction called The Swords, where the audience are invited to plunge a sword into a young woman, right through her, and she will be unharmed. In Aickman's tale, we don't know how the young woman manages to escape death. The finale of his story, played out in a dingy hotel room, is surreal and shocking and, most importantly, unexplained. For the screen, however, a convoluted explanation is offered, but too much explanation, as Aickman pointed out, only renders down truth for the relief of the timid. Robert Aickman may be playing intellectual games with his readers, but there is also dark humour in his work.
Actually, a lot of the details that he employs are comic. There's a deep irony there that it's not broad comedy, but it's very subtle English comedy that in many ways he was ahead of his time, and I think had he been working 30 years after he was working, and particularly on television, the sort of things he was doing began to emerge. So, for example, the diner in the hospice who's chained to the table with leg irons is absurd comedy. And maybe Aickman was drawing on surrealism, and he was a very cultured man, and you can think of any number of surreal artists who employed similar kind of imagery. And we have subsumed surrealism into comedy post-Python in this country, post-Monty Python. So maybe that's where that line of connection is. But nevertheless, to me, it feels there's a very English level of irony that's present, not just in those strange details, but also in his characterisation too.
Robert Aickman's books have never been bestsellers, but towards the end of his life, he did receive some recognition. His story, Ringing the Changes, was televised in 1968 as The Bells of Hell, starring Michelle Dautrice and Ronald Hines. Aickman must have been pleased when another of his stories, The Waiting Room, was turned into an opera by Dr. Jiří Novák in the early 1970s and broadcast on Czech television. In 1974, pages from a young girl's journal won the first World Fantasy Award, and he was also a nominee for a Life Achievement Award. Aickman was invited over to New England by the World Fantasy Committee, but this triumph soon descended into absurdity. In applying for a visa, Aickman, perhaps thinking of Oscar Wilde's visit to America almost 100 years earlier, stated that he would be undertaking a US lecture tour. He was refused entry, and embarrassed at having told friends the same story, he lay low in his London flat for the duration of the convention. In 1981, Aickman was also awarded the British Fantasy Award for his story, The Stains. People have told each other ghost stories in all times and cultures, and they have become an important part of our literary legacy. With the strange tales of Robert Aickman, the ghost story has been both subverted and updated in such a way that it should resonate long into the future.
I think he's given people permission to write about what intrigues us most, I think, simply the strangeness of human nature and the strangeness of the world and the possibility of anything occurring. And that's why I think he's an immensely important figure, because in any genre you need people along the way to give the genre a kind of jolt and to make it work again, to, as it were, start up the engine.
I think he will last and endure, like everybody lasts and endures in the artistic world, who has something to offer that is unique, that is very special, and that can't be touched or imitated, really. I mean, imitated, yes, but not successfully imitated by anyone else.
Aickman is actually now, I admire him more than ever. His light is undiminished. It gets stronger year on year for me, because every time I return to his stories, I find something new in them. They remain as alive and inspiring as they've ever done. He did what every writer aspires to do, which was became the most complete version of himself on paper that it's possible to be. And there's very few writers who pull that off.